In the harsh winter of 1876, when snow buried the Dakota Territory under 6 feet of frozen death, most men would have ridden past the skeletal figure collapsed beside the creek. Most men would have convinced themselves it was just another animal carcass, another casualty of nature's cruel indifference. But Jake Morrison wasn't most men. The decision he made in that moment, to dismount his horse and approach what others would have avoided, would either save 2 lives or doom them both. Because sometimes a single act of humanity can trigger a chain of events that changes everything. Sometimes, showing mercy to one person can determine whether you live to see another sunrise. What Jake didn't know as he knelt beside that dying Native American boy was that within hours, his small ranch would be surrounded by 200 of the most feared warriors on the frontier. He didn't know that his simple act of kindness would force him to make an impossible choice between survival and honor. And he certainly didn't know that the starving stranger he was about to help would soon hold the power to either protect him or watch him die. This is the true story of how one cowboy's compassion in the face of prejudice and fear would test everything he believed about right and wrong, about enemies and friends, and about what it truly means to be human when humanity itself hangs in the balance. The Dakota Territory stretched endlessly in every direction, a white desert of snow and ice that had claimed more lives than Jake Morrison cared to count. February 1876 had brought the worst winter anyone could remember, with temperatures dropping so low that spit froze before it hit the ground. Jake pulled his thick coat tighter around his shoulders as his horse, Thunder, picked his way carefully along the frozen creek bed. Jake had been riding since before dawn, checking his fence lines and looking for any cattle that might have wandered too far from the shelter of his ranch. At 32 years old, he had been working this land for nearly a decade, ever since he had saved enough money from his days as a trail driver to buy his own spread. It wasn't much, just a few hundred acres with a modest cabin and a barn that had seen better days, but it was his. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow as Thunder's hooves crunched through the icy crust. Jake was thinking about the warm coffee waiting back at the cabin when something caught his eye near a cluster of bare cottonwood trees. At first, he thought it might be a fallen branch or maybe a dead animal, but as he rode closer, his heart began to race. It was a person. Jake quickly dismounted and rushed toward the motionless figure lying face down in the snow. Even from a distance, he could tell it was a young man, probably no more than 18 or 19 years old. His long black hair was matted with ice, and his clothes, traditional Native American leggings, and a worn hide shirt, were inadequate protection against the brutal cold. Jake knelt beside the stranger and gently turned him over. The young man's lips were blue, his breathing shallow and labored. His dark eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and filled with pain, before closing again. Jake could see that the boy was close to death from exposure and starvation. His cheeks were hollow, his body thin and weak. Without hesitation, Jake scooped the unconscious young man into his arms. The stranger was lighter than he expected, nothing but skin and bones beneath the frozen clothing. Jake carried him to Thunder and, with some difficulty, managed to lift him onto the horse's back. He then climbed up behind him, holding the young man steady as they began the ride back to the ranch. The journey home felt like the longest 15 minutes of Jake's life. He could feel the stranger's body growing colder against him, and several times he wasn't sure if the young man was still breathing. Jake urged Thunder to move faster, but the deep snow made quick travel impossible. When they finally reached the cabin, Jake wasted no time. He carried the stranger inside and laid him on the small bed near the fireplace. He quickly built up the fire until it was roaring, then began the careful process of removing the young man's frozen clothing. The stranger's feet were white with frostbite, and Jake could see that he hadn't eaten in days. Jake heated water on the stove and began the slow process of warming the stranger's extremities. He had seen frostbite before and knew that warming too quickly could cause more damage. As he worked, he couldn't help but think about what he was doing. Relations between white settlers and the local tribes had been tense for years. Many of his neighbors would have left the young man to die, viewing all Native Americans as enemies. But Jake had never been able to see people that way. During his years on cattle drives, he had met men of all backgrounds: Mexican vaqueros, freed slaves, immigrants from Ireland and Germany, and, yes, even Native Americans who worked as scouts and guides. He had learned that a man's character wasn't determined by the color of his skin or the language he spoke. As the stranger began to warm up, he started to regain consciousness. His eyes opened slowly, and Jake could see the fear in them as he took in his surroundings. The young man tried to sit up, but Jake gently pressed him back down. "Easy there, son," Jake said softly. "You're safe. You were nearly frozen to death out by the creek." The stranger's eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the simple furnishings, the crackling fire, and Jake's weathered face. He said something in his native language, words Jake didn't understand but could tell were questions. "I don't speak your language," Jake said, moving slowly so as not to frighten the young man. "But I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Jake Morrison." The stranger studied Jake's face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he could be trusted. Finally, in heavily accented English, he spoke. "Why you help me?" The question hung in the air between them. Jake paused in his ministrations and looked directly into the young man's dark eyes. "Because you needed help," Jake said simply. "That's reason enough." The stranger continued to watch Jake with wary eyes as Jake prepared some warm broth. The cabin's small kitchen was simple, just a wood-burning stove, a rough table, and shelves lined with basic supplies. Jake ladled the broth into a tin cup and brought it to the bed. "What's your name?" Jake asked as he helped the young man sit up to drink. "Running Wolf," the stranger replied after a moment's hesitation. "I am Lakota." Jake nodded. He knew the Lakota were one of the most powerful tribes in the region. Their warriors were feared and respected throughout the territory. But looking at this thin, weak young man, it was hard to imagine him as part of a fearsome war party. "How long since you've eaten?" Jake asked. Running Wolf held up 4 fingers, then added a 5th. Jake's eyes widened. 5 days without food in this weather should have killed him. "What happened to you? Where's your tribe?" Running Wolf's expression darkened. "Soldiers came. Many killed. I escaped, but got lost in storm." He gestured weakly toward the window. "Walked many days." Jake felt a pang of sympathy. He had heard about the increasing conflicts between the army and various tribes, but he tried to stay out of politics and focus on his ranch. Still, the thought of soldiers attacking a village filled him with unease. "Well, you're safe now," Jake said. "Rest and get your strength back." But even as he said the words, Jake wondered if they were true. If Running Wolf was telling the truth about escaping from a military attack, there might be soldiers looking for him. And if his own people were searching for him, they might not appreciate finding him in the home of a white rancher. Throughout the day, Jake continued to care for Running Wolf. He prepared simple foods that would be easy on the young man's empty stomach. Thin soup, bread soaked in warm milk, weak tea. Running Wolf ate slowly, his body still recovering from the ordeal of starvation and exposure. As evening approached, Running Wolf was strong enough to sit up and talk more. Despite the language barrier, the 2 men began to communicate. Jake learned that Running Wolf was the youngest son of a respected chief, and that he had been separated from his family during the attack on their winter camp. "Your people will come looking for you," Jake observed. Running Wolf nodded gravely. "Yes, they look for survivors. But maybe too late." "What do you mean? If they find me soon, they think I'm dead. We'll seek revenge against soldiers." Running Wolf's eyes met Jake's. Against all white men. The implication hung heavy in the air. Jake understood that by helping Running Wolf, he might have put himself in danger. If a Lakota war party found their missing tribe member in a white man's cabin, they might not stop to ask questions. As night fell, Jake prepared a meal of beans and salt pork, the best food he had in the cabin. Running Wolf ate hungrily, color slowly returning to his cheeks. The firelight flickered across both men's faces as they sat in the small cabin, 2 strangers brought together by circumstance. "Tomorrow, I'm strong enough to travel," Running Wolf said. "I go find my people." Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure the young man would be ready to face the harsh winter again so soon. "Where will you look for them?" "North, towards Sacred Hills. My father, he takes survivors there." Jake knew the area Running Wolf was referring to, the Black Hills, which the Lakota considered sacred ground. It was also territory that the government wanted to control because of rumors of gold deposits. "That's 3 days' ride in good weather," Jake said. "In this snow, maybe 5 or 6 days." Running Wolf's jaw tightened with determination. "I must try." Looking at the young man's still weak condition, Jake made a decision that would change both their lives. "I'll help you get there," he said quietly. Running Wolf stared at him in surprise. "Why you do this? You not know me." Jake was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "I had a brother once. He died in the war, the Civil War. He was about your age, maybe a little younger." Jake's voice grew soft with memory. "If he had been lost and alone like you are, I would have wanted someone to help him get home." Running Wolf studied Jake's face in the firelight. "You are different from other white men." "Maybe," Jake said with a slight smile. "Or maybe we're all more alike than we think." Outside the cabin, the wind howled through the trees, and snow continued to fall. Neither man knew that less than 20 miles away, a large war party of Lakota warriors was following Running Wolf's trail. They had been searching for survivors of the military attack for days, and they had finally picked up signs that led toward Jake's ranch. Chief Red Eagle, Running Wolf's father, rode at the head of the search party. His face was painted for war, and his heart burned with grief and rage. The attack on his village had killed many of his people, including women and children. If he found that harm had come to his youngest son, there would be a terrible reckoning. The warriors rode through the night, following the faint trail through the snow. They moved like shadows across the white landscape, their horses' hooves muffled by the deep powder. By dawn, they would reach the area where Running Wolf's trail disappeared near Jake's property. Back in the cabin, Jake and Running Wolf had settled in for the night. Jake gave the young man his bed and made himself comfortable on the floor near the fire. As Running Wolf drifted off to sleep, he felt something he hadn't experienced since the attack on his village: hope. Jake lay awake longer, staring at the ceiling and thinking about what he had committed himself to. Helping Running Wolf travel to the Black Hills would be dangerous for many reasons. The weather alone could kill them both. And if they encountered soldiers or hostile settlers along the way, Jake's association with a Lakota warrior could cost him his life. But as he listened to Running Wolf's peaceful breathing, Jake knew he had made the right choice. Sometimes doing the right thing meant taking risks. His father had taught him that a man's character was measured not by what he did when it was easy, but by what he did when it was hard. Neither man slept deeply that night. Both sensed, perhaps instinctively, that their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't imagine. The storm that had brought them together was about to become something much larger and more dangerous than either of them realized. In a few hours, the sun would rise on a day that would test everything Jake believed about courage, compassion, and the thin line between civilization and chaos. The decision he had made to help a dying stranger would soon put him face to face with 200 of the most feared warriors on the frontier. And Running Wolf, still weak from his ordeal, would find himself in the impossible position of having to choose between the white man who had saved his life and the father who had come to rescue him. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Dakota Territory, and Jake Morrison woke to the sound of thunder nickering nervously in the barn. Something had spooked the horse, and Jake's instincts, honed by years on the frontier, told him to pay attention. He rose quietly from his makeshift bed on the floor and moved to the window, careful not to wake Running Wolf, who was still sleeping soundly on the bed. At first, Jake saw nothing unusual. The snow-covered landscape looked exactly as it had for the past week: white, silent, and seemingly empty. But thunder continued to pace restlessly in his stall, and now Jake could hear other sounds. Subtle sounds that didn't belong to the normal rhythm of a winter morning. The soft crunch of hooves on snow, the muffled jingle of metal against metal, the almost inaudible whisper of voices speaking in a language he didn't understand. Jake's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. They were surrounded. Moving carefully away from the window, Jake reached for his rifle and checked to make sure it was loaded. He had 6 bullets in the chamber and a box of ammunition on the shelf, but he suspected that wouldn't be nearly enough for what was coming. Running Wolf, he whispered urgently, gently shaking the young man's shoulder. "Wake up. We have company." Running Wolf's eyes snapped open immediately, and Jake could see that the young warrior's survival instincts were as sharp as his own. Without being told what was happening, Running Wolf seemed to sense the danger. He sat up slowly, his face alert and tense. "How many?" Running Wolf asked in a whisper. "I don't know yet." "A lot." Running Wolf closed his eyes briefly, as if listening to sounds Jake couldn't hear. When he opened them again, his expression was grim. "Many horses, many warriors." He paused, his head tilted as if concentrating. "My people." Jake felt a mixture of relief and terror. relief that it wasn't a military patrol or hostile settlers who might shoot first and ask questions later. Terror because he knew that Lakota war parties were not known for their patience when they found their people in the homes of white men. "What do we do?" Jake asked. Before Running Wolf could answer, a voice boomed across the snow-covered yard. The words were in Lakota, but the tone was unmistakably a command. Jake didn't need a translation to understand that whoever was out there was demanding that the people inside the cabin show themselves. Running Wolf's face went pale. "My father," he whispered. "Chief Red Eagle?" Jake asked, remembering what Running Wolf had told him the night before. Running Wolf nodded. "He calls for me to come out. He says he knows I am here. What happens if I go out there with you?" Running Wolf was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with the question. "I do not know. My father is very angry. The attack on our village, it killed many people. He may not listen to reason." Another shout came from outside, more insistent this time. Jake could hear horses moving closer to the cabin, their hooves crunching through the snow. He estimated there had to be at least 50 or 60 warriors out there, probably more. "He says come out now, or they will come in," Running Wolf translated. Jake took a deep breath. He had faced dangerous situations before, but never anything like this. He was one man with one rifle, facing what sounded like an entire war party of seasoned warriors who had every reason to see him as an enemy. "Listen to me," Jake said quietly but urgently. "When we go out there, you tell your father exactly what happened. Tell him I found you dying in the snow and brought you here to save your life. Tell him I was planning to help you get back to your people." Running Wolf nodded, but Jake could see the doubt in his eyes. In a young man's experience, white men who helped Native Americans usually wanted something in return. The concept of pure altruism was foreign in a world where the two cultures were at war. "He may not believe," Running Wolf said. "Then you'll have to make him believe," Jake replied. "Because if he doesn't, we're both dead men." A third shout came from outside, and this time was followed by the sound of weapons being readied. Jake heard the distinctive sound of arrows being nocked in bowstrings and the metallic click of rifle bolts being worked. "We go now," Running Wolf said, standing slowly. He was still weak from his ordeal, but he moved with the dignity and bearing of a chief's son. "You stay behind me. Let me speak first." Jake nodded and followed Running Wolf toward the door. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure it could be heard throughout the cabin. As Running Wolf's hand touched the door latch, Jake made what might have been his final decision as a free man. He left his rifle inside. If he walked out armed, the warriors would see it as a threat. If he walked out unarmed, he would be completely defenseless. But sometimes, Jake thought, showing trust was the only way to earn it in return. The door swung open, and Jake got his first look at Chief Red Eagle's war party. It was even more intimidating than he had imagined. The cabin was completely surrounded by mounted warriors, their horses forming a perfect circle with no gaps for escape. Jake had underestimated the numbers. There had to be nearly 200 men out there, all armed with rifles, bows, and traditional weapons. Their faces were painted for war, and their eyes held the cold fury of men who had lost everything and were seeking someone to blame. At the head of the group sat a man who could only be Chief Red Eagle. He was older than Jake had expected, probably in his 50s, with silver streaking his long black hair. His face was weathered by years of sun and wind, and his dark eyes held an intelligence that was both sharp and dangerous. He wore traditional Lakota regalia, but Jake could see a modern rifle resting across his horse's neck. When Red Eagle saw his son emerge from the cabin, his expression changed dramatically. The cold fury was replaced by relief and joy so intense that Jake could feel it even from 20 feet away. The chief spoke rapidly in Lakota, and Running Wolf responded in the same language. Jake stood in the doorway, trying to make himself appear as non-threatening as possible while still maintaining his dignity. He could feel the eyes of 200 warriors studying him, evaluating him, deciding whether he lived or died. The conversation between father and son continued for several minutes. Jake caught his own name mentioned several times, and he could see Running Wolf gesturing toward him and then toward the cabin. The young man was telling his story, but Jake had no way of knowing if his father was believing it. Finally, Red Eagle held up his hand for silence. The entire war party became as quiet as the snow around them. The chief's dark eyes fixed on Jake with an intensity that made him feel like his soul was being examined. Red Eagle spoke in English, his voice deep and commanding despite his accent. "You are Jake Morrison." It wasn't a question, so Jake simply nodded. "My son tells me you save his life." "That's right," Jake replied, keeping his voice steady. "I found him near death by the creek. He would have died if I hadn't brought him inside." Red Eagle studied Jake's face for a long moment. "Why you do this?" "My people and your people, we are enemies." It was the same question Running Wolf had asked the night before, and Jake gave the same answer. Because he needed help. A man doesn't let another man die if he can prevent it. Red Eagle's expression didn't change, but Jake thought he saw something flicker in the chief's eyes. Behind Red Eagle, the other warriors remained silent and motionless, but Jake could feel their tension. They were waiting for their chief's decision about what to do with a white man who had aided their missing tribe member. "You have food, blankets, medicine?" Red Eagle asked. "Yes, sir." "You give these things to my son?" "Yes, sir." "And I was planning to help him travel north to find you." Red Eagle's eyes narrowed. "You would leave your home to help Lakota warrior find his people?" Jake nodded. "I gave my word." For the first time, Red Eagle's expression softened slightly. In Lakota culture, a man's word was sacred, and Jake's willingness to honor his promise to Running Wolf clearly meant something to the chief. Red Eagle spoke again in Lakota to his son. This time, the conversation was longer and more intense. Jake could see Running Wolf gesturing emphatically, and he suspected the young man was pleading for Jake's life. While father and son talked, Jake became aware that not all of the warriors supported whatever Running Wolf was arguing for. He could see several of them shaking their heads and speaking angrily. One warrior in particular, a younger man with multiple scars on his face, seemed especially agitated. Red Eagle raised his hand again for silence, then turned back to Jake. "Some of my warriors, they say all white men are enemies. They say you held my son only to use him, to learn about our people, our movements." Jake felt his stomach drop. "That's not true. I know this," Red Eagle said quietly. "But they have seen much death, much betrayal. Their hearts are filled with anger." The scarred warrior spoke up, his voice hard and challenging. Even though Jake didn't understand the words, the meaning was clear. The man was demanding action against Jake. Red Eagle listened patiently, then responded in a tone that was clearly dismissive. The scarred warrior's face darkened, but he fell silent. "Blackhawk thinks I am weak for not killing you," Red Eagle explained to Jake. "He thinks mercy is the same as foolishness." "What do you think?" Jake asked. Red Eagle was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. "I think a man who would risk his life to save the son of his enemy is not a man to be killed without reason." He paused. "But I also think my warriors need to see that their chief is strong, that he will protect his people from those who would harm them." Jake understood what Red Eagle was saying. The chief wanted to spare Jake's life, but he couldn't appear weak in front of his war party. The political dynamics were complicated, and Jake was caught in the middle of them. "What would satisfy your warriors?" Jake asked. Red Eagle smiled grimly. "You ask dangerous question, white man." Before Jake could respond, Running Wolf spoke up. He addressed his father in Lakota, his voice urgent and persuasive. Jake could see that the young man was proposing something, but he had no idea what it might be. The conversation between father and son became heated, with several other warriors joining in. Jake stood quietly in his doorway, knowing that his life hung in the balance of a discussion he couldn't understand. Finally, Red Eagle turned back to Jake. "My son has made a proposal. He says you have proven yourself friend to the Lakota by saving his life. He asks that we make you brother to our tribe, that we adopt you as family." Jake blinked in surprise. He had never expected anything like this. What would that mean? It would mean you are under protection of the Lakota. No warrior could harm you without answering to me personally. Red Eagle's expression grew serious. But it would also mean you must prove yourself worthy of this honor. How? By undergoing the trials that all Lakota warriors must face. By showing courage, wisdom, and loyalty to the tribe. Jake looked at the faces around him. 200 warriors who just moments before had been ready to kill him. Now he was being offered the chance to become one of them. It was an incredible honor, but also an incredible risk. What happens if I fail these trials? Red Eagle's expression didn't change. Then, you die as a warrior, not as an enemy. Your death would have meaning. It wasn't exactly the reassurance Jake had been hoping for, but he understood the cultural significance of what was being offered. In Lakota society, Being adopted into the tribe was one of the highest honors that could be given to an outsider. "I accept," Jake said without hesitation. A murmur ran through the war party. Some of the warriors seemed pleased by his answer, while others appeared skeptical. Black Hawk, the scarred warrior who had been most vocal about killing Jake, shook his head in disgust. Red Eagle nodded slowly. "Then you'll come with us. We return to our winter camp, and there you will face the trials that will determine your fate." Jake looked back at his cabin, thinking about everything he would be leaving behind. His cattle, his land, his entire life as a rancher, all of it would have to wait. But he also knew he had no choice. Refusing Red Eagle's offer would mean certain death, and accepting at least gave him a chance to survive. "What about my horse and my belongings?" Jake asked. "Bring what you need. Leave the rest. If you survive the trials, you can return for your property. If you do not," Red Eagle shrugged, "you will have no need for earthly possessions." Jake went back into the cabin and quickly gathered a few essential items: his warmest clothes, some food, his rifle and ammunition, and a small leather pouch that contained his most precious possession, a photograph of his deceased brother. He left everything else exactly as it was, knowing he might never see any of it again. When he emerged from the cabin, Running Wolf was mounted on a horse that one of the warriors had brought for him. The young man looked much better after his night of rest and food, but Jake could see the concern in his eyes. "I am sorry," Running Wolf said quietly. "I did not mean for this to happen." "You did what you had to do," Jake replied. "And so did I." A horse was brought for Jake, a sturdy mare with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor. As he mounted, Jake realized that he was about to embark on the most dangerous journey of his life. Everything he thought he knew about survival, courage, and honor was about to be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. Red Eagle raised his hand, and the entire war party began to move. 200 horses and riders formed a long column that stretched across the snow-covered landscape. Jake found himself riding near the middle of the group, with Running Wolf beside him and several warriors keeping a careful watch on their new brother. As they rode away from his ranch, Jake looked back one last time at the small cabin that had been his home for so many years. He wondered if he would ever see it again, or if his bones would be left somewhere in the Dakota wilderness as a testament to his foolish compassion. But as he felt the power of the horse beneath him and saw the vast expanse of territory stretching ahead, Jake also felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the thrill of embarking on a true adventure. Whatever happened in the days ahead, his life would never be the same. The war party rode north toward the Black Hills, their destination a winter camp hidden in the sacred mountains that the Lakota would defend with their lives. And riding among them was a white cowboy who had just committed himself to proving that he deserved to be called their brother, or dying in the attempt. The journey to the Lakota winter camp took 3 days through some of the most rugged terrain Jake Morrison had ever encountered. The war party moved like a flowing river across the landscape, following ancient paths that were invisible to Jake's untrained eyes, but clear as highways to the experienced warriors who led them. Chief Red Eagle set a pace that tested both horses and riders. They traveled from dawn until well after dark, stopping only when the horses needed rest and water. Jake quickly learned that the Lakota could endure hardships that would break most white men. They rode through bitter cold without complaint, ate sparingly from dried meat and pemmican, and slept on the frozen ground with nothing but thin blankets and their own body heat for warmth. On the second night, as they camped in a sheltered valley, Jake began to understand the magnitude of what he had committed himself to. Black Hawk, the scarred warrior who had opposed sparing Jake's life, approached the fire where Jake sat eating a small portion of dried buffalo meat. "White man," Black Hawk said in heavily accented English, his voice filled with contempt. "You think saving one boy makes you worthy to be Lakota?" Jake looked up at the warrior's fierce face. In the firelight, Black Hawk's scars were even more prominent, evidence of battles fought and survived. Jake could see that this man had earned his position through blood and courage, and that he viewed Jake as nothing more than a pretender. "I think actions speak louder than words," Jake replied carefully. "I'm willing to prove myself through whatever trials your chief sets for me." Black Hawk laughed harshly. "You know nothing of what awaits you. The trials are not games for children. They are tests that separate true warriors from cowards." He leaned closer to Jake, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Many men have died attempting them. Strong men, brave men, men with Lakota blood in their veins. Then, I guess I'll find out if I'm strong enough, Jake said, meeting Black Hawk's gaze without flinching. The confrontation might have escalated, but Running Wolf appeared at Jake's side. The young warrior spoke sharply to Black Hawk in Lakota, and, although Jake couldn't understand the words, the tone was clearly defensive. Black Hawk responded angrily, and for a moment Jake thought the two men might come to blows. Chief Red Eagle's voice cut through the argument like a knife. The chief spoke a single word in Lakota, and both younger men immediately fell silent. Black Hawk glared at Jake one more time, then stalked away into the darkness. What was that about? Jake asked Running Wolf. The young man looked uncomfortable. Black Hawk says you bring bad medicine to our people. He says white men always bring death and destruction, even when they pretend to help. What do you think? Running Wolf was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. I think you saved my life when you could have left me to die. That is not the action of a man who brings death. He paused. But Black Hawk has seen much fighting. His family was killed by soldiers 2 summers ago. His anger runs very deep. Jake nodded, understanding that he was caught in the middle of forces much larger than himself. The conflict between whites and Native Americans had created wounds that might never heal, and his presence among the Lakota was a constant reminder of that painful reality. On the 3rd day, they reached the winter camp, and Jake got his first glimpse of how the Lakota lived during the harsh months of cold and snow. The camp was hidden in a valley surrounded by tall pines, protected from the worst of the winter winds. Dozens of teepees were arranged in careful patterns, with larger structures for meetings and ceremonies. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and Jake could see children playing in the snow despite the bitter cold. As the war party rode into camp, people emerged from their shelters to greet the returning warriors. Jake was immediately the center of attention, and he could feel hundreds of eyes studying him with mixtures of curiosity, suspicion, and hostility. Word of his presence had apparently traveled ahead of them, because the camp seemed to be expecting his arrival. Chief Red Eagle led the procession to the center of the camp, where a large fire burned in front of the biggest teepee. An elderly woman emerged from this dwelling, and Jake could see immediately that she was a person of great importance. Her clothes were elaborately decorated with beadwork and feathers, and she carried herself with the dignity of someone accustomed to command. "My wife, White Dove," Red Eagle said to Jake as they dismounted. "She is the spiritual leader of our people, the keeper of our sacred traditions." White Dove studied Jake with sharp, intelligent eyes. When she spoke, her voice was strong despite her advanced age. Red Eagle translated her words. "She says you have the look of a man who has faced hardship, but she wonders if you have the spirit to face what lies ahead." "Tell her I'm willing to find out," Jake replied. White Dove nodded when Red Eagle translated, then spoke again at some length. Jake could see that she was asking detailed questions, and Red Eagle answered each one carefully. Finally, she turned back to Jake and spoke in English. "You will stay in the teepee of unmarried warriors," she said. "Tomorrow, when the sun reaches its highest point, the trials will begin." That night, Jake found himself sharing quarters with a dozen young Lakota men who were either preparing for their own warrior trials or had recently completed them. Most were friendly enough, curious about the white man who had been granted the opportunity to join their ranks. But Jake could sense that they were also evaluating him, trying to determine if he would bring honor or shame to their warrior society. One young man, barely 18 years old, spoke excellent English and seemed particularly eager to talk. His name was Swift Arrow, and he explained that he had learned the white man's language from a missionary who had lived with the tribe for several years. "What are the trials like?" Jake asked him as they prepared for sleep. Swift Arrow's expression grew serious. "There are 3 trials. The first tests your courage in the face of physical pain. The second tests your wisdom and spiritual strength. The third tests your loyalty to the tribe above all else." "Can you tell me what they involve?" "I cannot give you details. That would be against tradition. But I can tell you that each trial pushes a man to his limits. Some men fail the first trial and are sent away in disgrace. Others pass the first 2, but cannot complete the third. What happens to those who fail the third trial?" Swift Arrow's voice dropped to a whisper. "They die." Jake spent a restless night thinking about what lay ahead. He had faced danger many times in his life: stampeding cattle, violent thunderstorms, armed outlaws, and the general hazards of frontier life. But Those have been situations where his experience and skills gave him advantages. The trials would test him in ways he couldn't prepare for, using standards he didn't fully understand. Morning came gray and cold, and Jake was awakened by the sound of drums echoing across the camp. Swift Arrow explained that the drums were calling the tribe to witness the trials, and that such ceremonies were rare and sacred events. Jake was given a simple meal of corn mush and herbal tea, then told to bathe in the icy stream that ran through the valley. The cold water was a shock to his system, but he understood that this was part of the ritual preparation. When he emerged from the stream, Running Wolf was waiting with traditional clothes for him to wear. "These belong to my brother," Running Wolf explained as he helped Jake dress in the buckskin shirt and leggings. "He died 3 years ago fighting soldiers. My father says you may wear them to honor his memory." The clothing was decorated with intricate beadwork and painted symbols that Jake didn't recognize. As he dressed, he felt the weight of the honor being accorded to him, as well as the responsibility that came with it. When the sun reached its zenith, Jake was led to a large open area in the center of the camp. The entire tribe had gathered to watch: men, women, children, and elders. They sat in a circle around the ceremonial space, their faces solemn and expectant. Chief Red Eagle stood in the center of the circle, flanked by White Dove and several other tribal elders. When Jake approached, the chief raised his hands for silence. "Jake Morrison," Red Eagle said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "You have asked to be accepted as a brother to the Lakota people. This is not a request we take lightly. Our brotherhood must be earned through trials that test every aspect of a warrior's character." Jake nodded, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. "The first trial tests your ability to endure pain without losing your courage or your dignity," Red Eagle continued. "Pain is part of a warrior's life. In battle, a man who cannot master pain will fail his brothers and bring dishonor to his people." White Dove stepped forward, carrying a wooden bowl filled with what looked like paint and a bundle of sharp metal instruments. Jake's stomach tightened as he realized what was coming. "You will receive the marks of a Lakota warrior," Red Eagle explained. "These marks will be cut into your skin and filled with sacred paint. The process is long and painful, but a true warrior endures it without cry or complaint." Jake looked around the circle of faces watching him. He could see skepticism in many eyes, particularly among the older warriors who had undergone these same trials in their youth. Black Hawk sat among them, his scarred face showing clear expectation that Jake would fail. "I'm ready," Jake said. White Dove gestured for him to lie down on a buffalo hide that had been spread in the center of the circle. As Jake positioned himself, she began to chant in Lakota, her voice rising and falling in ancient rhythms that seemed to connect the ceremony to generations of warriors who had undergone the same trials. The first cut came without warning, a sharp line of fire across Jake's chest as White Dove's knife traced a pattern into his skin. Jake bit down hard on the leather strip he had been given, determined not to cry out. The pain was intense, but manageable. The second cut was deeper, and the third deeper still. As White Dove worked, cutting intricate symbols into Jake's chest, arms, and back, the pain built to levels that Jake had never experienced. Each cut felt like a line of molten metal being drawn across his flesh, and the sacred paint that was rubbed into the wounds added another layer of burning agony. Jake lost track of time as the ceremony continued. The world narrowed to nothing but pain and the need to endure it. He could hear the chanting of the tribe, feel the eyes of hundreds of people watching him, but all of it seemed distant and unreal compared to the immediate reality of the knife cutting into his flesh. At some point during the ordeal, Jake's vision began to blur, and he felt himself starting to lose consciousness. The pain had reached levels that his body could no longer process, and he teetered on the edge of blacking out. But through sheer force of will, he held on, focusing on his breathing and the rhythmic sound of the chanting. When White Dove finally set down her knife, Jake had been cut dozens of times. The symbols she had carved into his skin told the story of his adoption into the tribe, his rescue of Running Wolf, his willingness to risk his life for others, and his commitment to honor the Lakota way of life. "The first trial is complete," Red Eagle announced. "Jake Morrison has shown that he can endure pain like a warrior." Jake struggled to sit up, his body trembling from shock and blood loss. Every movement sent new waves of pain through his wounded flesh, but he managed to meet the chief's eyes with steady gaze. The second trial will test your wisdom and spiritual strength, Red Eagle continued. You will enter the Sweat Lodge alone and remain there until the spirits grant you a vision. Only when you have received this vision will you be allowed to emerge. Jake nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what was being asked of him. He had heard of sweat lodges, but had never experienced one. Swift Arrow had mentioned that this trial tested spiritual strength, but Jake wasn't sure what that meant in practical terms. The Sweat Lodge was a small dome-shaped structure covered with buffalo hides. Steam and heat poured from the entrance, and Jake could see glowing stones piled in the center. White Dove handed him a wooden bowl filled with water and spoke instructions in Lakota. She says you must pour water on the stones to create steam, Running Wolf translated. You must stay inside until you receive a vision from the spirit world. Do not come out until the spirits have shown you something important. Jake crawled through the low entrance into the lodge and immediately felt the intense heat envelop him. The air was so hot and humid that breathing became difficult within moments. He poured water on the glowing stones as instructed, and great clouds of steam billowed up around him. As the minutes passed, the heat became almost unbearable. Jake's fresh wounds throbbed with each heartbeat, and sweat poured from his body. The small space became like an oven, and Jake began to understand why this was considered a trial. The physical discomfort was so intense that it required tremendous mental discipline to endure it. But as time passed, and Jake settled into the rhythm of breathing the superheated air, something strange began to happen. The pain from his wounds seemed to recede, and his mind began to feel detached from his physical body. The darkness of the lodge seemed to deepen and change, becoming less like a physical space and more like a gateway to something else entirely. Jake wasn't sure how long he had been in the lodge when the vision began. At first, he thought it was just a product of dehydration and heat exhaustion. But the images that appeared in his mind were too vivid and coherent to be mere hallucination. He saw himself as a child, playing with his brother David on their family farm in Missouri. He saw David's face as clear as day, heard his laughter, felt the bond between them that had shaped Jake's entire approach to life. Then the vision shifted, and he saw David lying wounded on a Civil War battlefield, reaching out for help that would never come. The vision changed again, and Jake saw Running Wolf collapsed in the snow, near death from cold and starvation. But this time, instead of Jake finding him, the vision showed what would have happened if Jake had ridden past. He saw Running Wolf dying alone, saw Chief Red Eagle and his warriors finding the body, saw the rage and grief that would have driven them to attack every white settlement in the territory. Finally, the vision showed Jake something that took his breath away. He saw himself, older and scarred by the trials, standing beside Chief Red Eagle as peace negotiations took place between the Lakota and the United States government. He saw himself serving as a bridge between two worlds, helping to prevent the terrible wars that seemed inevitable. When Jake finally emerged from the Sweat Lodge, he was weak and disoriented, but he carried with him the memory of what he had seen. Chief Red Eagle and White Dove were waiting for him, and they could apparently see in his face that he had experienced something profound. "What did the spirits show you?" White Dove asked. Jake described his vision in detail, and he could see the elders exchanging meaningful looks as he spoke. When he finished, White Dove nodded slowly. "The spirits have shown you the path of the peacemaker," she said. "This is a sacred calling, one that requires great courage and wisdom. You have passed the second trial," Chief Red Eagle announced. "Tomorrow, you will face the final test, the trial of ultimate loyalty." As Jake was helped back to the warrior's teepee to rest and recover from his ordeals, he couldn't shake the feeling that the most dangerous part of his journey was still ahead. The vision had shown him a purpose he had never imagined, but it had also made him realize how much was at stake. The third trial would determine not just whether he lived or died, but whether he would have the chance to fulfill the destiny the spirits had revealed to him. Jake Morrison spent a fitful night in the Warrior's Lodge, his newly carved wounds throbbing with every heartbeat, and his mind wrestling with the implications of his vision. Swift Arrow had brought him willow bark tea to help with the pain, but sleep remained elusive. The sacred cuts on his chest and arms were healing according to Lakota tradition, without bandages, exposed to the air so that they would form the permanent scars that marked him as a warrior. As dawn approached, Jake could hear activity throughout the camp. Voices speaking in urgent whispers, the sound of horses being saddled, and the general bustle of people preparing for something important. When Swift Arrow returned to the lodge, his face was grave. "What's happening?" Jake asked. "Scouts have brought word," Swift Arrow replied quietly. "A column of soldiers is approaching from the east. They will reach our valley by midday." Jake felt his stomach drop. "How many?" "More than 100. They carry the flag of the 7th Cavalry." The 7th Cavalry. Jake knew that regiment by reputation. Led by officers who believed that the only good Indian was a dead Indian, they had been responsible for numerous attacks on Native American villages throughout the territory. If they had tracked the war party to this hidden camp, it meant trouble of the worst kind. "Are we going to fight them?" Jake asked. Swift Arrow's expression grew even more troubled. "That decision will be made by the Council of Elders. But first, you must complete your final trial." Chief Red Eagle says the soldiers' arrival makes the trial even more important than before. Before Jake could ask what that meant, Running Wolf appeared at the entrance to the lodge. The young warrior's face showed the strain of the situation facing his people. "My father calls for you," Running Wolf said. "The third trial begins now." Jake followed Running Wolf through the camp, noting how quickly the Lakota were preparing for potential conflict. Warriors were checking their weapons, women were gathering essential supplies, and children were being moved to more protected areas. Despite the danger approaching, however, the normal activities of the camp continued. The trials were too sacred to be postponed, even in the face of military threat. Chief Red Eagle waited in the ceremonial circle, flanked by White Dove and the other tribal elders. But now there were also several warriors Jake didn't recognize, men whose faces bore the hard lines of recent combat, and whose eyes held the cold fury of those who had lost too much. "Jake Morrison," Chief Red Eagle said as Jake approached. "The final trial comes at a time of great danger for our people. This is not coincidence. The spirits have arranged events so that your loyalty will be tested under the most difficult circumstances possible." "What do you need me to do?" Jake asked. Before Red Eagle could answer, one of the unfamiliar warriors stepped forward. He was a man in his 40s with graying hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. "I am Crazy Horse," the warrior said simply. Jake felt a chill of recognition. Even white settlers knew the name Crazy Horse. He was perhaps the most feared and respected war leader among all the Plains tribes. His presence here meant that the situation was even more serious than Jake had realized. "The soldiers who approach our camp are led by a man called Custer," Crazy Horse continued. "He is the one who attacked the winter camp where Running Wolf was nearly killed. He seeks to finish what he started, to destroy our people completely." Jake nodded, understanding the gravity of what he was being told. "Your final trial is this," Chief Red Eagle said. "You must choose between the loyalty you owe to your own people and the loyalty you have sworn to us. The choice you make will determine not only your fate, but possibly the fate of this entire tribe." "I don't understand," Jake said. Crazy Horse smiled grimly. "The soldiers do not know the location of this camp. They're following old trails, searching in the wrong places. But you could guide them here. You could lead them directly to us, and in exchange, they would certainly spare your life and probably reward you greatly." The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. "You're asking me to choose between betraying you and betraying my own race. We are asking you to choose between right and wrong," White Dove said quietly. "Between honor and expedience. Between the man you have always been and the man you could choose to become." Jake looked around the circle of faces watching him. These people had given him the chance to prove himself worthy of joining their tribe. They had shared their food, their traditions, and their sacred rituals with him. But they were also asking him to make a choice that could be seen as treason against his own country. "What happens if I refuse to guide the soldiers here?" Jake asked. "Then you will fight beside us when they attack," Crazy Horse replied. "You will stand with your Lakota brothers against the men who share your skin color and your language. And when the battle is over, if we survive, you'll be one of us forever. And if I choose to guide the soldiers?" Chief Red Eagle's expression didn't change. "Then you will have failed the trial, and you will die as we have always said those who fail must die. But You will die knowing that you chose personal survival over honor. Jake realized that he was facing an impossible situation. No matter what choice he made, he would be betraying someone. If he helped the soldiers, he would be responsible for the deaths of people who had shown him kindness and acceptance. If he fought against the soldiers, he would be taking up arms against his own countrymen. How long do I have to decide? Jake asked. The choice must be made now, Crazy Horse said. The soldiers will be here within hours, and we must know if we have a brother fighting beside us or an enemy among us. As Jake struggled with the decision, he thought about the vision he had received in the Sweat Lodge. He had seen himself serving as a bridge between two worlds, helping to prevent the terrible wars that seemed inevitable. But how could he fulfill that role if he was forced to choose sides in the very conflict he was meant to help resolve? The answer came to him suddenly, and with it a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane. I'll guide the soldiers, Jake said. A murmur of surprise and disappointment ran through the gathered warriors. Several hands moved toward weapons, and Jake could see the pain in Running Wolf's eyes. Even Chief Red Eagle looked shocked by his decision. But not to attack you, Jake continued quickly. I'll guide them into a trap. The murmur stopped abruptly, and every eye focused on Jake with intense concentration. Explain, Crazy Horse said simply. There's a narrow canyon about 2 miles east of here, Jake said, his plan forming as he spoke. If I can convince the soldiers that the war party went through there, I can lead them into an ambush. Your warriors could position themselves on the canyon walls and attack from above. The soldiers would be trapped with no way to retreat. Crazy Horse and Chief Red Eagle exchanged glances. Jake could see them evaluating his proposal, weighing its chances of success against the risks involved. Why should we trust you? Blackhawk spoke up from among the watching warriors. How do we know this is not just another trick by the white man? Because if it fails, I'll die with the rest of you, Jake replied. If I'm going to betray you, this would be an unnecessarily complicated way to do it. Chief Red Eagle studied Jake's face for a long moment. You would risk your life on this plan? I would risk my life to prevent unnecessary bloodshed on both sides, Jake corrected. If we can defeat this military column without attacking the main camp, it might convince other commanders to think twice before launching similar expeditions. White Dove spoke up for the first time during the discussion. The spirits showed him a vision of serving as a peacemaker, she reminded the others. Perhaps this is how that destiny begins to unfold. Crazy Horse nodded slowly. It is a good plan, but it requires perfect timing and absolute trust. His eyes locked with Jake's. If you betray us, I will personally hunt you to the ends of the earth. Understood, Jake replied. The next hour passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Jake was given fresh clothes that would make him look like he had been hiding in the wilderness, and his appearance was carefully arranged to suggest that he was a survivor of some kind of attack. Crazy Horse positioned his best warriors along the walls of the canyon Jake had described, while Chief Red Eagle prepared the camp for a possible siege in case the plan failed. Running Wolf approached Jake as he prepared to leave the camp. I'm sorry that my rescue has caused you so much trouble, the young warrior said. No trouble, Jake replied. Just an adventure I wasn't expecting. If you survive this day, you will truly be my brother. And if I don't, Running Wolf smiled sadly. Then, I will make sure the songs of our people tell the story of the white man who chose honor over safety. Jake mounted his horse and rode east toward the approaching cavalry column. As he left the valley, he could see Lakota warriors moving like shadows among the rocks and trees, taking their positions for the ambush. Everything now depended on his ability to convince Colonel Custer that he was exactly what he appeared to be, a frontier rancher who had survived an attack, and was willing to help the military track down the hostiles responsible. Jake found the cavalry column exactly where the scouts had said it would be, a long line of blue uniformed soldiers moving methodically through the snow-covered terrain. At the head of the column rode a man Jake recognized from newspaper photographs as George Armstrong Custer. The famous colonel sat his horse with the confidence of someone who had never met an enemy he couldn't defeat. When the advance scouts spotted Jake, he raised his hands to show he was unarmed and rode slowly toward them. Within minutes, he was surrounded by soldiers with rifles pointed at his chest. "Who are you?" demanded the sergeant leading the patrol. "Jake Morrison," Jake replied, trying to project the proper mixture of relief and exhaustion. "I've got a ranch about 15 miles south of here. Indians attacked 3 days ago, kill my cattle, burn my buildings. I've been hiding in the hills ever since. The sergeant studied Jake's appearance, taking in his rough clothing and the genuine scars from his recent trials. How many Indians? Maybe 50 or 60. War party led by Chief Red Eagle himself. At the mention of Red Eagle's name, the sergeant's expression sharpened. Are you sure about that? I saw him myself. Big man, silver in his hair, riding a black horse with white markings. The description was accurate enough to convince the sergeant, who gestured for Jake to accompany him to the front of the column. When they reached Custer, Jake repeated his story, adding carefully chosen details that would make it more believable. Did you see which direction they went? Custer asked. Jake pointed toward the canyon where Crazy Horse's warriors were waiting. They headed that way, toward the narrow pass through the rocks. I think they're using it as a way to move through the territory without being seen. Custer studied the terrain in the direction Jake had indicated. That would make tactical sense. A war party could move through there quickly and emerge behind our lines. If we move fast, we might be able to catch them in the canyon, one of Custer's officers suggested. Jake held his breath as Custer considered the suggestion. Everything depended on the colonel's decision to pursue the supposed war party into the trap. We'll investigate, Custer decided. Morrison, you'll guide us to the exact spot where you saw them enter the canyon. As the cavalry column changed direction and began moving toward the ambush site, Jake rode beside Custer and his officers, playing the role of helpful civilian guide while his heart pounded with nervousness. In less than an hour, he would discover whether his desperate plan would save both sides from a catastrophic battle or whether he had just led over 100 soldiers to their deaths. The canyon loomed ahead, its narrow opening looking peaceful and innocent in the winter sunlight. Jake knew that within those rocky walls, some of the finest warriors on the Great Plains were waiting with rifles and bows, ready to turn the peaceful canyon into a killing ground. There, Jake said, pointing to the canyon entrance. That's where I saw them go in. Custer raised his hand to halt the column, then studied the canyon through his field glasses. Jake watched the colonel's face, trying to read his thoughts. If Custer suspected a trap, the plan would fail spectacularly. Looks quiet, Custer mused. But that could mean they've posted sentries. What are your orders, sir? Asked his second-in-command. Custer lowered his glasses and turned to look at Jake one more time. For a terrible moment, Jake thought the colonel was going to see through his deception. But then Custer smiled with the confidence of a man who had never lost a battle. We go in, Custer said. Column formation, weapons ready. If there are hostiles in that canyon, we'll finish what we came here to do. As the cavalry began to move toward the canyon entrance, Jake realized that there was no turning back now. In the next few minutes, his loyalty trial would be complete, and he would discover whether he had truly earned the right to call himself a brother to the Lakota people. The cavalry column entered the canyon in perfect military formation, their horses' hooves echoing off the narrow rock walls. Jake rode beside Colonel Custer, every nerve in his body screaming with tension as they moved deeper into what he knew was a carefully prepared killing ground. Above them, hidden among the rocks and sparse vegetation, Crazy Horse's warriors waited with the patience of seasoned hunters. Jake forced himself to maintain the appearance of a helpful civilian guide, pointing out supposed tracks in the snow and commenting on the terrain as if he were genuinely trying to help the soldiers track their quarry. But with each step deeper into the canyon, he became more aware of the magnitude of what he was orchestrating. How much further do you think they went? Custer asked, his voice echoing slightly off the canyon walls. Hard to say, Jake replied, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold air. The tracks were pretty clear for the first mile or so, but the wind has been covering them up. The canyon walls rose on both sides now, creating a natural corridor that was perhaps 50 yards wide at its narrowest point. Jake knew that once the entire cavalry column was committed to this passage, there would be no quick way to retreat. The soldiers would be trapped exactly as he and Crazy Horse had planned. As they rounded a bend in the canyon, Jake saw something that made his blood run cold. About 200 yards ahead, a single Lakota warrior sat motionless on his horse in the middle of the canyon floor. Even at this distance, Jake could recognize the distinctive silhouette of Crazy Horse himself. Contact! Shouted one of the advance scouts. Indian warrior, directly ahead. Custer immediately raised his hand to halt the column. Through his field glasses, he studied the lone figure waiting for them. Jake held his breath, wondering if the war chief's presence would alarm Custer enough to make him retreat. Just one man, Custer mused. Could be a scout, or maybe a decoy. Sir, this could be a trap, suggested his second-in-command, Captain Benteen. Custer lowered his glasses and looked around at the canyon walls surrounding them. For a moment, Jake thought the colonel might order a retreat. But then Custer's famous arrogance and confidence in his own tactical superiority reasserted themselves. If it's a trap, it's a poor one, Custer said dismissively. One warrior against an entire cavalry regiment? Even if there are more hostiles hidden in these rocks, we have them outnumbered at least 2-1. Jake wanted to tell Custer that he was making a fatal miscalculation, that the warriors hidden in the canyon walls were some of the finest fighters on the continent, armed with modern rifles and fighting to protect their families. But instead, he remained silent and watched as Custer made the decision that would determine the outcome of the day. Forward, Custer commanded. Battle formation. We'll show these savages what happens when they challenge the 7th Cavalry. The column began to move again, with soldiers drawing their weapons and spreading out into battle line. Jake found himself caught in the middle of over 100 men preparing for combat, all of them believing they were about to win an easy victory against inferior opponents. As they approached to within 50 yards of Crazy Horse, the war chief raised his rifle above his head and let out a piercing war cry that echoed off the canyon walls like the voice of the mountains themselves. It was a signal, and Jake knew that in seconds, the hidden warriors would begin their attack. "Take cover!" Jake shouted, throwing himself from his horse just as the first volley of rifle fire erupted from the canyon walls. The ambush was devastating in its precision and coordination. Dozens of Lakota warriors had positioned themselves in carefully chosen spots along both walls of the canyon, and their first coordinated volley caught the cavalry column in a deadly crossfire. Soldiers began falling from their horses immediately, many of them killed or wounded before they even realized they were under attack. Custer, to his credit, reacted quickly to the ambush. "Dismount," he shouted over the gunfire. "Take defensive positions. Return fire." But the cavalry's standard tactics were poorly suited to fighting in the confined space of the canyon. Their horses, terrified by the gunfire and the echoing war cries of the Lakota warriors, began to panic and bolt. Some soldiers found themselves on foot and separated from their weapons, while others struggled to find adequate cover on the canyon floor. Jake pressed himself against a large boulder and tried to make sense of the chaos around him. The air was filled with gunpowder smoke, the screams of wounded men and horses, and the constant crack of rifle fire. Through the confusion, he could see Crazy Horse still mounted in the center of the battlefield, directing his warriors with hand signals while calmly firing his rifle at the trapped soldiers. "Morrison!" Custer's voice cut through the noise. The colonel had taken cover behind a fallen horse and was bleeding from a wound on his arm. "You said there were only 60 of them." Jake realized that his moment of truth had arrived. He could continue the pretense of being an innocent guide caught in an unfortunate situation, or he could reveal his true role in the ambush. Looking around at the carnage surrounding them, he made his choice. "I lied," Jake shouted back. "There are over 200 warriors up there, and they've been waiting for you." Custer's face went white with shock and rage. "You led us into a trap. You're working with them." Before Custer could say more, a Lakota bullet struck the rock near his head, showering him with stone fragments. Jake saw the colonel duck for cover and then begin shouting orders to his surviving men. The battle continued for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes. The Lakota warriors had every advantage: superior position, better knowledge of the terrain, and the element of surprise. But the cavalry soldiers were well-trained professionals who fought back with desperate courage, knowing that surrender meant death. Jake found himself in the impossible position of being caught between two sides, neither of which could afford to trust him completely. Lakota bullets whistled past him just as close as cavalry bullets, and he began to realize that his plan, while tactically successful, might not ensure his own survival. The turning point came when Captain Benteen, Custer's second-in-command, managed to organize a group of soldiers to make a fighting retreat toward the canyon entrance. If they succeeded in reaching open ground, they could regroup and possibly bring reinforcements to rescue the survivors of the ambush. Crazy Horse apparently recognized the same threat. He left his position in the center of the canyon and began moving his warriors to cut off the soldiers' line of retreat. Jake watched the war chief directing his men with hand signals, orchestrating the battle like a master chess player moving pieces on a board. It was then that Jake saw his opportunity to truly prove his loyalty to his new Lakota brothers. Captain Benteen and his group were moving directly toward a hidden position where Jake knew several warriors were waiting. If the captain reached that position, the warriors would be caught in the open and vulnerable to cavalry fire. Without thinking about the consequences, Jake stood up from his cover and shouted a warning in the few words of Lakota he had learned. Soldiers coming. Many soldiers. His warning gave the hidden warriors time to adjust their positions and prepare for Benteen's attack. When the cavalry group reached the spot where Jake had seen the warriors, they found themselves facing another devastating volley of rifle fire that stopped their retreat and forced them back into the main body of the trap column. Custer, who had witnessed Jake's warning to the Lakota warriors, now looked at him with undisguised hatred. "Traitor!" the colonel screamed. "You'll hang for this." But Jake was no longer listening to Custer's threats. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with the consequences. He had committed himself fully to the Lakota cause, and there could be no turning back. The battle began to wind down as the cavalry's ammunition ran low and their casualties mounted. Of the more than 100 soldiers who had entered the canyon, fewer than 40 were still able to fight. The rest were dead, wounded, or scattered in panic throughout the rocky terrain. Crazy Horse appeared at Jake's position, moving through the battlefield with the fluid grace of a born warrior. The war chief's face was painted for battle, and his eyes held the hard satisfaction of a man who had successfully avenged wrongs done to his people. "You have proven yourself today," Crazy Horse said in English. "You chose to fight with your Lakota brothers against your own people. This takes great courage." "It was the right thing to do," Jake replied. "These soldiers came here to kill innocent people. I couldn't be part of that." Crazy Horse nodded, then gestured toward the surviving cavalry soldiers. "What should we do with the survivors?" Jake looked around at the defeated men, bloodied, exhausted, and completely demoralized. Among them was Custer, still defiant despite his desperate situation. Jake realized that his answer to Crazy Horse's question would determine not just the fate of these soldiers, but also the kind of man he would become. "Let them go," Jake said quietly. Crazy Horse raised an eyebrow. "They came here to kill our women and children. Why should we show them mercy?" "Because showing mercy makes us better than them," Jake replied. "If we kill them all, we become the monsters they say we are. But if we let them live, they'll carry word back to their commanders about what happened here. Maybe some of those commanders will think twice before launching similar attacks." Crazy Horse was silent for a long moment, considering Jake's words. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You speak wisdom. This is the thinking of a true peacemaker." The war chief called out orders in Lakota, and his warriors began to disarm the surviving soldiers, but did not harm them further. Custer and his men were allowed to tend to their wounded and prepare for the long march back to their base, though they were stripped of most of their weapons and supplies. As the defeated cavalry column began its retreat from the canyon, Custer approached Jake one final time. The colonel's face was haggard with pain and exhaustion, but his eyes still burned with fury. "This isn't over, Morrison," Custer said quietly. "You're a traitor to your own race, and there will be consequences for what you've done here today." "Maybe," Jake replied, "but I can live with the choices I've made. Can you say the same?" Custer didn't answer. He turned and walked away to join his defeated men, leaving Jake standing alone in the canyon where he had finally completed his transformation from White Rancher to Lakota warrior. The journey back to the winter camp took several hours, with the victorious war party moving slowly to allow the wounded warriors to keep up. Jake rode beside Running Wolf and Swift Arrow, still processing everything that had happened. The cuts on his chest and arms from his first trial had stopped bleeding, but they throbbed with each heartbeat, a constant reminder of the price he had paid for acceptance into the tribe. When they reached the camp, the entire